Book 2 of 2020 was Why We Get the Wrong Politicians by Isabel Hardman. So I bought this book because I'd become a little bit more interested in politics. There was a general election coming up in Britain and I'd started to watch things like House of Commons, and I had wondered about politicians because they have quite a bad reputation. They come across as being a little bit incompetent or a little bit disingenuous or a little bit lacking in integrity. And so I thought that this book would be quite interesting to figure out, why it was that we were getting the wrong politicians. So I'd kind of flirted with the idea that if I'd become an MP, I would do a much better job than the current members of Parliament. But then after reading this book, it's completely put me off ever going into any aspect of politics or that kind of career in the civil service or whatever, because there are kind of systemic problems with becoming a politician which prevents them from being able to do a good job. It has a lot of kind of restrictions on what they do, so that even though they might try to be very good at their job, it's very difficult for them to do so. There tends to be a political elite with a lot of people being educated in places like Eton or Harrow that end up as a politician, and they're often, privately educated in those places, and they're from quite an affluent socioeconomic background, and so they're not very representative of the populace because many people don't have the style of life. And how could we possibly expect somebody to understand what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck or to live on the breadline if they've never experienced it before? Conceptually it's very different from first-hand experience, and so it's not really a person's fault that they can't empathise with that if they've never been in a situation such as that. It's quite difficult to do that. So how could they possibly try to understand why it's necessary for welfare and things like that if they've never been in those kind of situations? Now, the reason why there is this unrepresentation in politics, Hardman kind of discusses, is because there's an expectation that politicians work for free. So in order to become an MP, you have to campaign to win a seat, so to win electoral seat in a constituency, and you have to kind of self-fund that campaign. And they've kind of done polls on how much people spent to become an MP of their own money, so that they're not really being paid for the job and they're having to self-fund. So the majority of them are spending about £30,000, and the Conservative MPs are actually having to pay more than other MPs such as Labour. So those are, places are even more expensive to self-fund. And they have to do this, and even though they might be very, very hard working, they might not get their seat in their constituency because often people vote along party lines. They vote for the party as a whole, so they're looking more towards kind of the leader rather than the actual person who's in their constituency that they would go to. There's when they campaign and they go to like door to door and they ask who they're voting for. Often people will say, we like you, we think you're doing a really good job, but we don't like the leader of the party, and so therefore they vote for somebody else. So it can be quite frustrating. You can be very, very good at your job and do everything that you can for your constituents, but they still won't vote for you because they're voting for the party as a whole. So there's no guarantee that you're going to get that job and that job's going to be secure. Like, it's likely that it's not going to be, and that even though you work very hard, you might not have a job, when the next election comes along. The other thing as well is that politicians are often selected by a panel, and this panel decides whether or not you will campaign for a safe seat or whether you'll campaign for a marginal seat or whether you'll campaign for a seat that's perhaps not safe. So you have to kind of impress the panel, or at least network connections with the panel, so that you can kind of curry favour, so that you're more likely to be put into a safer seat, so that when election comes around you're more likely to keep your seat and keep your job. If you're in a seat that you've got no chance of winning, you can be self-funding and working for free and for nothing, just so that you can kind of work your way up with the panel to get put in a different seat that's more safe. So there's a lot of kind of uncertainty and instability. And when I think about it, like, I'm in the education sector, and there's always instability in jobs because there's lots of like temporary contracts and things like that, particularly within like a university sector, and they're always kind of striking because of it. But you don't see politicians doing the same. Like, you know, if it was any other job, it wouldn't be acceptable. But because it's a politician, it's deemed that it's okay that they don't have job security. Whereas, you know, other jobs, it seems to be that it's not okay, but for those it is. I think I've just repeated myself there, haven't I? Also, because there's an increase in working class that are not unionised, so trade unions are kind of a thing of the distant past. There doesn't seem to be as many trade unions, and they used to be responsible for getting working class people into politics because they would fund them. So there's less opportunity now for those types of grassroots kind of approaches into politics. You know, in America, there's lots of organisations that try to campaign for grassroots. So Alexandra Cortez, whatever she's called, Orsino, I think it is. She was from a grassroots organisation because she was working class before she got into politics. And out of all of the ones that the company kind of tried to campaign for, she was, you know, one of about 4, I think, that got in, and there was a lot of them that started off. So it's very, very difficult to get into politics if you're coming from that kind of background and you're not coming from that affluent, privately educated. Because as well, the thing with privately educated people is that they have connections with the people that they went to school with. So it's not just about being affluent, it's about the networking that you had when you were growing up. Lots of people don't have that. So, you know, if someone's deciding whether to give you a seat in a safe seat in a constituency, if they know you from school, then you've got a lot better chance. So really, the other thing as well is that if you have views that are not in line with the current party ideology, that's not going to win you favour in that selection of which seats you go into. So you have to kind of toe the party line. You have to go along with what the current status quo is of that party to be able to get selected to get into a seat. So you have to almost like minimise yourself until, you know, because even within a party, so for example, within the Labour Party, Corbynism, not everybody in the Labour Party is into kind of that leftist, very leftist kind of views. There's quite a lot in the Labour Party that are quite centrist in comparison to them. Obviously not as centrist as other parties, and obviously not right-wing like Conservatives, but depending on who's in at the time is going to depend on whether you are more likely to get in the seats. So, you know, unless you decide to take like an unpaid internship and build those connections first. But again, you're not being paid. There's for a long time that you've got to work, not being paid. And who would do that in a job for as long as they have to? I mean, obviously you do, you know, when you're first starting out, but if you've got a family and you've got responsibilities, you're not really going to become a politician because it's not in your best interests. And so you might be great at the job, but you're just not attracted to it for those reasons. And as well, like the best people for the job, so people that would be really good at it, that are really well educated and that have, you know, money from even business acumen, they wouldn't take a pay cut to become a politician. Like, they get paid lots more money, so why would they? You know, people complain about how much politicians are paid, but for the work that they actually do and the hours that they work, it's kind of fair that they get paid that much. You know, if they were in any other job working those hours, that would be an expectation. And they are away from their families, and it is quite stressful, and they do get attacked by the media, which has psychological impacts. You know, everyone's talking about the media being horrible to celebrities, but what about how horrible they are to politicians? That's quite damaging to a person when you're just trying to do your job. And, you know, people who are very successful, lawyers and, you know, people who have careers in business and such, who would perhaps bring that kind of representation to politics, wouldn't go for a job that pays less, that has increased expenses, and that is insecure. Because, you know, if you don't win your seat or your party doesn't win, everyone's lost their job, everyone's redundant, everyone has to find another job. So it's kind of a constant state of uncertainty, which is very unsettling. And obviously if you've got those responsibilities with family, it's just not worth it really, unless you had a partner that, you know, could take the slack for a little bit. And it can, be quite frustrating. You've worked really hard. It doesn't matter what you do. It's because of other people that it has an impact on your life. And you very much, as well as a politician, behest to the central party because you are censored and you are instructed of how to vote by your party whips, which is something that I wasn't aware of. There's a website which says something like Work for You or something about how politicians have voted, and I always thought like politicians say like what they stand for, but then they go and vote and they vote completely against it. So for example, Nick Clegg was all about reducing student fees. We'll never increase student fees, they said, as Liberal Democrats. This was when they were about 3,000. And then when he went into coalition with Tories, with Conservatives, all of a sudden tuition fees were £9,000 a year, and everyone was kind of like, what on earth, when they've been, saying what they've been saying for so long, and that's been their kind of ideology, and then they've completely voted, I mean, I'm not too sure actually, I haven't looked into whether he'd actually vote for or against for that, but it's just a kind of random example that I just thought of there, where a politician says something but then it ends up that it doesn't carry through, and so I was unaware that these whips, I mean, essentially if you don't vote the way that you're being told to vote, then you risk your reputation and your career, because people control whether you're in seats that are going to be successful and whether you keep a job or not. So you have to kind of go along with what they say, and also you don't have the time or the experience to scrutinise policy and legislation in the depth that's needed for you to then go and vote for them, and so you have to kind of almost trust that your party whips know what they're doing, which sometimes isn't the case. So it's quite a difficult job in that sense, because you're having to vote on things that you might not actually agree with if you looked into them. There's been a lot of times where bills have been passed that haven't had the right amount of scrutiny and have led to disastrous consequences for constituents, and then they've come back to the politician to complain about it, and then the politicians realised and then had to go back to Parliament and explain what the problems are to then rectify the issue. So it's like almost like they're creating more work for themselves as well. And politicians are not given a specific job description, so they have to split their time across a diverse job role. They've got to go into Houses of Parliament and they've got to vote on legislation. They've got to, ask questions that are going to be pertinent to discussions of passing bills and whatever in the House of Commons. Then they've got to go and work in the constituency and do surgeries with people and solve lots of problems that they don't know what's coming to them. And they're having to write lots of letters to people because, that is usually what they spend a lot of time doing. So it's quite difficult, how do you actually split your time? What's the most important thing to do? Things like being in the media as well and having them on your side, like, is another aspect of it that you need to kind of think about, otherwise that can damage your career. As well, party whips instruct people to ask pointless questions in debates so that bills get tabled, and things like backbenchers can put forward bills that actually benefit the populace, but if the party whips of the parties don't agree with them, they kind of just take up time in the chamber so that they don't go through and they don't pass. So there's a lot of manipulation going on as to whether certain things get said or done in the House of Commons. It's more of like a theatre rather than somewhere where work actually gets done. And I've actually watched the House of Commons discussions and seen when people have stood up and said pointless things, have brought to the attention. So for example, a Conservative MP will stand up and will say something good about what Boris Johnson has done, or will ask a question that they already know the answer to, but by having the discussion it highlights something good that the government have done. And there's kind of that going back and forth all the time, and so when you watch it just is really pointless, and you can understand why a lot of MPs don't turn up to the Commons, because they've got a lot of important work to do in the constituencies, but then they get criticised for that because they're not seen on the debate in there. But it is just pointless. It's a pointless activity because nothing actually really gets done in that House of Commons. Obviously there's a bit of grilling from opposition parties of the government, which is necessary, but often they kind of are aware what's kind of coming and how to address those. And a lot of the time people will have had private conversations before they bring it to the chamber, so that's kind of when they're already aware of it happening. And they do count as well of how many people talk in a chamber, and if you talk more in a chamber you're supposed to get a higher rating, but what the content of what they're actually saying, the substance of what they're saying, is not actually that good. And so that if that was analysed, it would present a very different picture of how successful these politicians are. And fortunately, you know, the House of Commons tends to pass bills or push bills through with wasting time, so that legislation doesn't have the right amount of scrutiny, but it does go to the House of Lords. And this actually made me grateful for the House of Lords, even though they are an unelected House of Representatives, and it is quite unrepresentative. They do allow the scrutiny of policy, and I have watched House of Lords debates as well, and they are a lot more refined and a lot more mature, and they do look into legislation and scrutinise things, and obviously launch investigations and whatever, and so inquiry, should I say. And so without them, the House of Commons the government would be able to put bills through that don't actually benefit everybody. So the House of Lords are kind of like a safety net. Although having said that, Hardman does point out that once it gets to the Lords and they debate it and they send back the government, you know, recommendations of what to change, and the government kind of don't really do much in response to it and kind of just pass it through anyway. So there's a lot of bills that get passed that are not beneficial, that haven't been adequately scrutinised, that do have negative impacts on the populace, and that they have to sort them out kind of like later on. But usually what tends to happen is bills get passed under a government, and there's an election and the government changes or the leadership changes, and they inherit all the problems of not scrutinising that legislation. So it kind of just becomes you inherit a load of shit, basically. You've got to kind of deal with it as a leader. And obviously that, for example, Theresa May inherited all the crap from David Cameron, and she's got a really bad reputation as a leader, but it's just because she inherited loads of rubbish from him. The other thing is that there are what are called select committees, and these are when there's a bill that needs scrutiny, and whips instruct people to go along and not say anything, or instruct the people to go along who they know will agree with the bill, so that there's no kind of adequate scrutiny of the legislation. And the opposition party will obviously meet and make suggestions, but they tend to just get tabled and not actually taken on and changed. So nothing really, it's kind of like a formality. They just meet, they discuss it, they don't really have a proper conversation about it or change anything. They don't really go in there to change anything. The government knows exactly what they want and they usually get it, basically. So if the government's in, they just get to basically do what they want. There's not much to kind of stop them because they've obviously got that majority, which is very worrying, because you'd think that an institution like the House of Commons would have these select committees and would have these, House of Lords scrutiny and things, and that there would be adequate check-in that things have been discussed and changed, but it doesn't tend to happen. There's no kind of follow-up, there's no kind of closing of the loop, so politicians get away with a lot that they shouldn't be getting away with. And as I mentioned before, these have far-reaching consequences for the constitution. I've been watching The Crown, that's why it just popped out of my mouth. For the constituents, because they come and complain to the politicians in the surgeries that they put on, and they have to deal with, these issues. So they create more work for themselves by not scrutinising the legislation, but they don't have the skills or the time to do it. So it just becomes like a really frustrating process. Hardman does also discuss about how difficult it is to be a politician, because you are spending a lot of your time away from your family. You're across two homes, which I don't know about you, but I've been, when you get into a relationship and you start staying at the other person's house quite often, you're living out of a bag. It's not really that good, and yeah, they might have other homes or whatever, but it's not the same. Your family is where your home is, and they're away from their family. And so there's marriage breakdowns. There's also kind of like a drinking culture in the houses at Westminster, should I say. So there's a lot of kind of alcohol available on site, and they're having to kind of like vote on legislation until like 10 o'clock at night. So it's not like respectful of, a 9-to-5 job. It's like they're working all hours. And if you don't have fixed hours and you are just kind of in and out of working, you end up working more hours than what you should be. And you want to kind of take part in that culture because then it builds networks, and then you kind of are thought better of and you get more job prospects and things. So if you kind of don't take part in it, then it's not as good for you. But then there's like, it makes you feel isolated as well. If you don't take part, then you're isolated from your family. You don't really see your friends very often because you're always working. You don't have those kind of links that retain good mental health. You might not as well have time to exercise and keep yourself healthy because you're always working. You've got the criticality of the media and judging everything that you do. You never see politicians really getting commended for what they do, and they do a lot of good things for everybody. So why is that not being picked up on? And naturally it's going to cause marital difficulties because they're away from their spouse for lots of time, and job insecurities and financial consequences of that as well makes it kind of very stressful to be a politician. And the other thing as well is that the roles that they're being asked to do, so say for example somebody becomes a minister, you're not really given the minister position based on your expertise or your qualifications or experience. You just kind of get put into a position. And I remember actually watching a GQ interview with Alistair Campbell and I don't know which politician it was because I've watched quite a few. I've watched it with Ed Miliband and a few other politicians of both sides, Conservative and Labour. And there was one of them, I can't remember who it was, but they basically had experience of, I think it was kind of like foreign policy in Asia and Africa. And they were really wanted to be a minister within those areas because that was their expertise. I don't know if it was both Africa or Asia or just one of them. And they decided to make this person a minister of somewhere completely different. And they were really confused because they spoke lots of different languages that would have been appropriate and they had expertise, but they just weren't given that opportunity to be a minister in something that they were experiencing that they could do particularly well. And if you look at the government now, you have ministers. So for example, I think Matt Hancock originally was the Minister for Entertainment and Media, and now he's the Health Minister. Like, how can you go from one to the other and bring skills across like that? Like, it would make sense, for example, to have someone who's been in education to be the Education Secretary, but that never happens. Someone who used to be a nurse or a doctor or some kind of, health person to be the Health Minister. Like, it would kind of make more sense, but that just doesn't tend to happen. They kind of just slotted randomly into positions, and it's almost, I think Hardman actually puts in some conversations between this person. In fact, maybe it wasn't a GQ interview, maybe it was actually in this book, and they were just really gobsmacked by it because they were just randomly put into the minister position, and it made absolutely no sense, but the leader just needed people to fill a position, so that's what happened. So people are being put in these positions and you can't really say no because it's your career, but you don't really have the expertise to do it, but then neither does anybody else, so you might as well do it because you probably would be better than somebody else. So overall, my impression of politicians now is a lot more compassionate than what it was initially. I feel really sorry for them because it seems to be a really difficult job and they get no thanks for it. And anybody with an element of, I was thinking of like several words for element, but that were actually better than element, but I went with element. There's not even I forgot what I was saying now. Given like what the actual role is like, there's nobody with an ounce of sanity that would ever pick to become a politician. Like, nobody would do it. Like, it's just, if you were thinking about, okay, should I apply for this job or that job or whatever, there's so many jobs out there that you would be able to get that are better paid, that have better hours, that get you the same level of fulfillment, and not any of the negatives that go with it. So why would you become a politician? I wondered to myself why these people have become politicians, because I don't see why you would pick that if you cared about yourself as a person, because it's not a good career to go down for your own kind of sanity. So I really respect them. I feel sorry for them, and I think anybody who has a negative opinion of politicians should really read this book because it does give you a completely new insight into politics.